Welcome to the Rediscovery channel. This is a channel where every week I and my good friend Stilgar meet to discuss topics from history that usually the other person hasn't heard about and doesn't know about. Today we're also joined by Blue Hour, another friend of mine and also a fellow author. So today what I want to do is revisit a topic that I already talked about, and that is the legend of Prester John. And the reason I want to do this is because the video actually did a lot better than I thought it would, and we got some comments, but there was a little bit of contention in the comment section, and there was some people saying that my depictions of Prester John were inaccurate for various reasons, and I'll put a screenshot of that there at in the video. But what I wanted to do is just go over the legend of Prester John a little bit more, and then explain the logic behind the illustrations that I created. And I think both of you guys saw my illustrations, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So to begin with, there's at least 3 different versions of the Prester John legend. So the original Prester John legend was set in India. And then there was also a version where he was set in Tartary, like associated with the Tatars and Mongols. And then the third and final version of the Prester John legend, he was set in Ethiopia. So saying like your depiction of Prester John is wrong, or he's supposed to be like this or like that, it depends upon which legend of the Prester John you're referring to, or like which iteration of the legend. It's like Santa Claus, for example. The American version of Santa Claus, he's in the North Pole. And like the Dutch version of Santa Claus, which Stilgar talked about, he actually lives in Spain. So let's go ahead and in like the Santa Claus legend, Prester John was originally based on a real guy, but then of course the legend went way beyond that and became pretty embellished. So the reason the legend starts is there was actually a South Indian priest who visited Europe in 1122 AD, and his name was Mar Yohanan, also known as Patriarch John, of the Church of St. Thomas, the St. Thomas Christians, which is the original Christian denomination of India that was started by the Apostle Thomas. And the area that they correspond to is today called Kerala, and it's one of the southernmost states of India today, and it's still got a very large Christian population. So this guy visited Europe in 1122, and he went to Rome. And I don't know how he managed to get to Europe, because there was all the Islamic realms and the caliphate in between Europe and India, and there was not really any traffic going between Europe and India. There was the silk trade, but of course all that stuff went through the Middle East first. The Muslims were the middlemen. So this guy gets to Rome, and he starts talking about his holdings, I guess, and his church that he was in charge of had some land around it, and he starts describing everything and talking about the riches, and I guess there was some kind of language barrier issue. I mean, there certainly must have been, and I'm assuming I didn't find in my research how he was able to communicate with the Europeans that were there, because in fact the native language of Kerala is called Malayalam, and it's not even part of the Indo-European language family. It's quite different, and they don't use the Latin text, and to this day they still don't. So I'm not sure what language he even used to talk to these people, or to talk to each other. I'm guessing it was probably Latin, either Latin or Greek, because of course the Catholic clergy, they could all speak Latin during the medieval period, and even to this day a lot of them still can. So the point is, during the communication, things got really exaggerated, and like the Pope was kind of incredulous. Like the Catholic priests, they thought that this guy was saying he had a huge realm, like full of riches and subjects and everything. So they made him swear to God, that he was telling the truth. And there was a misunderstanding, and they took this guy to be like some great king. And they had the impression that he was a physical ruler of a state and perhaps an entire country, and that it was a autonomous religious state. And to be fair, during this time, the Catholic Church had the Papal States, which was autonomous territory that they actually ruled over in a secular fashion as well. So language barrier is going to create misunderstandings. Even if you have people communicating via a second language, because their first languages are different, they will still quite often use the second language in a different way. And then before we go on, today in Kerala, there's actually a lot of people that have John as their last name. I knew some people like that, this old church that I used to go to. So at any rate, the next thing that happens is in 1165, there's a letter that comes out. And this letter is delivered to Pope Alexander III, the Byzantine Emperor Manuel Comenos, and the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. And they each get a copy of this letter, which is supposedly from Prester John, the great king and emperor of India. And so in 1175, the Pope, who I guess believed the letter, sends his friend Philip to go find the Emperor Prester John, but that guy never comes back. So probably he went into the Middle East along the way and got killed or enslaved or something like that. The letter might have been an attempt to generate more support for the Crusades, which ran from 1095 to 1571. So this letter is like during the period that the Crusades are going on. So the letter talks about the extreme riches of Prester John, who is the emperor of India, and he has kings that each rule a kingdom that are underneath him in the same way that feudal lords in Europe would be underneath the kings there. So basically, he says, I've got kings for vassals. And it's according to the letter, there's abundant gold and jewels everywhere. There's rivers of jewels. And I'm not going to read the whole letter, but I want to read a few paragraphs to you guys and also for the viewers. So paragraph 4, he says, 72 kingships serve us in bondage, and of those but few are Christians, and each of them has a king by itself, and these are all tributary to us. In our country are born animals, elephants, dromedaries, camels, hippopotami, crocodiles, metagallinari, carnitae, neri, onceratae, pantherae, onagri, white and red lions, white bears, white owls, silent grasshoppers, griffins, tigers, ogresses, hyenas, wild buffaloes, sagittari, wild men with horns, corneti, coreri, satyrs, and women of the same race, pygmies, cynophali, giants, 40 cubits high, one-eyed men, cyclopses, the bird that is called phoenix, and almost all the kinds of animals under heaven. In our country there is abundance of milk and honey. In another quarter in our land, no poison hurts, no frog croaks, no snakes hiss in the herbage, no venomous animals can abide there or do harm to anyone. In the midst of some races called pagans, through one of our provinces, a river called Iden runs. And this river, after coming from paradise, runs noiselessly through all that kingdom by various mazes. And here are found natural stones. These are their names: smaragdi, sapphire, carbuncle, topazion, chrysolite, onychine, beryl, amethysti, sardine, and many other precious stones. So it's obvious that the person that wrote this letter has never actually been to India and doesn't really know anything about it. But then moving on, that was paragraph 4. Now I want to read paragraph 8. Beyond this stony river, there are 10 tribes of the Jews. Though they presume they are kings, yet they are subject to us, and are tributaries to our majesty. In another kingdom of ours, beyond this place, where the island lies, there are worms, called in our tongue salamandri, and those worms can live only in fire, and they have around them skins like the skins of worms that make silk. And to spin this is the work of our ladies in our palace, and thereof is made all kinds of apparel for the use of our majesty. And these clothes cannot be washed, save in a large and strong fire. In gold, silver, precious stones, in dromedaries and camels is the abundance of our greatness. No one is poor among us, no adulterer is found there. All men of strange lands, to wit, guests and pilgrims, our gentleness receives. No thieves, no oppressors, no misers are found in our midst. There is no envy in our midst. And then moving down a little bit more, paragraph 11. We have many places, the bravest nation in our world, and ugly withal. We lord it over the races called Amazons and Brahmans. The palace wherein our majesty dwells was made in the form and likeness of that which the apostle Thomas called for, that which the apostle Thomas ordained for Windoforns, king of India, and its wings and structure are exactly like it. The columns of the hall, its pillars, its fretwork, conic from some tree called I can't, I don't know. The roofing of the hall is made of some plants called Hebenus, the reason being that no one in the world can in any way burn it. On the farthest extremities, on the top of that ball, there are 2 apples of gold, and in each of them there is a precious stone called carbunculus, so that the gold may give light during the day, and the stones by night. The largest of the hall are made of stones called sardoniae, blended with erastes, the reason being that no one may secretly bring poison with him. Other things in the hall are made of plants called Hebenus. The windows were of crystal. The tables to eat on in our palace are some of them gold, and others of the precious stone amestic. The pillars that support the tables are of whalebone. Before our palace there is a street, wherein our justice is wont to look on those who fight in duel. The top of the hall and its walls are made of onychius, the purpose being that energy may arise in our combatants by the virtue of the stones. In that hall, light is not kindled at night, save that which the precious oil called balsam feeds. So the whole letter I'm not going to read. Those are just some parts that I thought were the most interesting. But there's other things, like they have a huge tall tower, and then they have things like glowing gemstones, which is kind of like Tolkien with the Silmarils and the things that Fëanor made. And I'll give you guys the link to the letter if you want to read the whole thing. But basically, it bears almost no resemblance at all to India or any other real life place. Whoever wrote this letter, which is unknown, they put together all the things that they thought were cool and interesting. So they've got like giants and cyclops, Amazons, synechocephaly. Of course, in the paragraph that I read, they translated it, like they rendered it a bit differently, but the synechocephaly are also there, which, in case any of our viewers don't know, those are the dog-headed guys, the dog-headed men. And 10 tribes of Jews. Why 10? Because if you guys recall, like in the Old Testament, Israel split, and most of the tribes were in the northern kingdom called Samaria, and the Assyrians came and they took those people out. And what the Bible says when it mentions it is the Assyrians took them out and took them to such and such a place, I forget where, and they're there to this day. So a lot of people during the Middle Ages, they just made assumptions based on that stuff. And I guess they figured those 10 tribes must have gone all the way to India. So more is added to this legend by Sir John Mandeville, who writes the Book of Marvels and Travels, which I have a copy of. It's an interesting read. It's mostly bogus stuff, but there's a little bit of truth to the legend, like they mentioned the Brahmins. So medieval Europeans knew about the Brahmins, and for some reason they also knew about that mountain in Sri Lanka, which we talk about in another video. But this was the original basis for the legend. So Mar Yohanan was a real guy, but Prester John was... The relationship between Mar Yohanan and Prester John is like the relationship, it's more distant than the relationship of the American version of Santa Claus and, Saint Nicholas of Myra. So there was a real guy that kind of kicked it off, but obviously, it got way beyond that. So yeah, originally it was set in India, and that's what I talked about in the other version, was like the Indian version of the legend. So there was also a Tatar version. Like they thought maybe when the Mongols started coming and attacking the Muslims, then Europeans heard about it and they thought maybe the Mongols were a friend because they were giving Muslims a bloody nose. So some people assumed that, okay, maybe Prester John is with these guys. And of course, that turned out not to be the case. And it also, as Europeans began to explore and actually make contact with India, they learned that it's nothing at all like the Prester John legend, like he's not there. So the next shift is they move the Prester John legend over to Africa. So in 1306, you have Emperor Wedem Arad of Abyssinia, which today is in the area that the country would call Ethiopia, but it's not like a perfect alignment. So Wedem Arad sends 30 envoys to Europe, and he's looking for, in his words, the king of the Spains, plural. And he wants them to help him fight against the Muslims who are just constantly attacking them. Since they overran the Nubians earlier, the next target is the Christian kingdoms further to the south, like Abyssinia. So these guys, they go to Europe, and on the way back, they stay in Portugal for a bit, and they're interviewed by a guy named Giovanna da Carignano, who is a geographer, I assume a map maker. And he gets the idea, the original interview that he has with them is lost. The transcript of it is lost, but it is retold by another guy named Jacobus Philippus Foresti da Bergamo, another Portuguese guy, I would assume. And he writes it down in this book called the Supplementum Chronicarum. And he associates the Abyssinians with Prester John. And by 1340, as far as like the popular culture goes, pretty much everybody in Europe has associated Prester John with Abyssinia. So they think, oh, it's in Ethiopia, it's to the south of Egypt. That's where this great kingdom is. And of course, the Ethiopian version of Prester John is the last iteration of this legend. And the Portuguese start sending all sorts of expeditions into Africa to try and find it and make a permanent alliance. And eventually they, let me say first, why move it to Africa? Why move this legend there? Well, on the one hand, they knew that it's not in India. But then it was also a fairly well-known fact that there were Christian kingdoms in Africa that the Muslims did not take when they did their initial jihad and took over Egypt and the Berber realms. So there was the kingdom of Makuria, which in the ancient world was referred to as Nubia. The kingdom of Makuria was a Christian kingdom that was affiliated with the Coptic Church of Egypt. Of course, they were not Egyptians. They were descendants of Nubians. and they resisted the Muslims a lot longer than Egypt did. But eventually, they too got overrun. And then after that, the Muslims pushed south towards the area that today we call Ethiopia. And so those people were the next target, Abyssinia. So part of the reasons why Muslims were going after those people is because they were afraid that these African kingdoms would form an alliance with the Europeans and kind of team up and squeeze them out of Africa. So they made sure that they conquered them, and then they would not leave the Ethiopians alone. It was a constant war, I guess, a war of attrition. So also, I should say that in the ancient period as well as the medieval period, the majority of European scholars assumed that India and Ethiopia were directly adjacent to one another, and they were divided by relatively small strip of ocean. So they could easily reconcile, like, oh, we were only slightly off. It's okay. It's not in India, but it is in Ethiopia. They're right next to each other. It's just a slight mistake, just a small mistake. But the Portuguese, they eventually do make it to Abyssinia, and they, for a while, they establish relations with the Ethiopians, and then of course there's embassies, formal embassies that eventually do go to Europe. And during that early time period, the Catholic priests and such insisted on referring to Abyssinia as the realm of Prester John. But of course, the Ethiopians were confused by that. They were like, we never had anybody by that name in our kingdom. So coming to my artwork that I did, my artwork that I did was depicting the original version of Prester John, the Indian legend, which of course, that version of India is not at all like the real place. The way that and what I'll do is, as I'm talking about this, I'm going to drop in the slideshow the different depictions. So when I set out to do my illustrations, well, actually, first of all, the reason I set out to do my illustrations was because I could not find very many artistic depictions of Prester John in the first place. There's like less than 10 of them that I was able to come across. And that's for all three iterations of the legend. So the depictions of the Indian version of Prester John doesn't at all look like an Indian guy. He looks more like Gandalf, actually, or like a medieval kind of European king with European style clothes and kind of Gothic style architecture. And of course, medieval Europeans had no idea what people in India actually looked like, or their clothes, or their architecture. So I went off of the written descriptions in Sir John Mandeville and in the letter of Prester John, and I used the few illustrations that were actually available as a guide as well for my color palette and for my for the styles that I used, the architecture and the gear and such. And one of the things they said in Sir John Mandeville is that everybody wore purple. It was a cheap material for them. So that's why I had all my guys wearing purple. And really what they were doing, the way they speculated about India, and when I first started reading it in the Sir John Mandeville's book, I was like, oh, let's see what they knew about India in the medieval period. Might be cool. And like the first thing I read is some guy going on about how, oh, in the mountains there's diamonds that grow from the ice over in India. And I was like, what? And it just got more and more off base from there, basically. So really it was more akin to in the 21st century, it's easy for people to say, like, how could they be so wrong? How could they be so stupid? But there's absolutely no contact with India, between India and Europe. So it was really more speculating about what was there and writing stories about what was there was more like was more akin to the early 20th century, where they used to speculate about what sort of people live on Mars and, make up how their buildings look and their architecture and all that kind of stuff, which was popular in the early 20th century. There's even, I have a series called Flash Gordon Goes to Mars. It was made in the 1930s. And they did they came up with costumes and buildings and everything. And of course, if there actually was anybody living on Mars, everything in the depictions would have been completely wrong. So, and then, and as far as the letter goes today, the analogy that I would make is, you guys know about SETI, right? Oh,
SETI?
Yeah, you heard of SETI, not the Pharaoh, but the project.
Oh no.
So SETI
I've
is
heard about them, about finding alien life forms, I guess.
Right. It's like a bunch of hippies that are, I guess they are scientists probably, but they're trying to pick up signals constantly from aliens that might be transmitting to Earth or past it. It's like the search for alien life. So it would be like if the SETI scientists came out and said, "Hey, we received a message from aliens. There's this alien empire where you have this great king, and he's ruling over all these different alien species." And that's pretty much what Prester John was. I mean, he was ruling over like giants and cyclopses and cyanocephaly, Amazons, satyrs, all these things. So that's kind of what it is. Like, it's not, when I did my artwork, I set out to depict, the legend itself. Like, Prester John is not a real person. So I wanted to make that clear for everybody in the comment section, and also to understand the logic. Like, I was depicting the first version of it, which is what my source material had. So anyway, that's all I got. I don't know if you guys want to add anything to that.
Well, I didn't know anything about the legend at first. This is my first time hearing about it.
Yeah, I figured you would probably find the legend useful, because it is kind of like the medieval version of sci-fi.
Right.
And if you read like the letter is, I guess, like maybe a page and a half, and that was what kicked all this off. But Sir John Mandeville, he's got like a few chapters in his book that talk about it, and they go into a lot more detail. And like in one of the chapters, he talks about a guy named Catalonabes, who's this noble, and he has this big mansion, and his mansion has robots in it, and he mentions that. And basically, he has this scam where he tricks different knights into killing people for him, killing people on his behalf, and he promises them that like when they die, they'll be like reincarnated as immortals and live inside his mansion realm. And of course, they just die and they get killed, and eventually, like Catalonabes is destroyed. He's killed and his mansion is destroyed. But there's all kinds of weird stories like that. It's pretty cool. It's like the medieval version of sci-fi. Yeah.
Yeah, one thing I did notice was that you mentioned that Ethiopia as well. Well, because of my recent topic, they were cut off as well from the Christian world by the Muslims, and the Portuguese went looking for them. And at one point, they actually helped the Ethiopians kick out the Ottomans, and they were using Portuguese riflemen to do this. So I guess, yeah. Anyway, I'm not sure what I'm trying to say, but I think it's interesting.
Yeah, that's what I heard. Is like the Portuguese, they were hoping that that Prester John would be able to find them, and then they pinned a lot of their hopes on Ethiopia once the legend shifted there. But then when they actually got to Ethiopia, it turned out the Ethiopians needed their help, so they ended up trying to help them repel the Muslims. Like Islam was a pretty serious existential threat, up until like the 1700s for a lot of people. It's amazing that the Ethiopians were able to survive the onslaught for as long as they did, because they didn't have help from anybody. They were totally cut
Yeah.
off.
They were totally cut off. Yeah.
Yeah.
Why was
Yeah.
there 3 versions of the tale at first?
Because well, originally it was just in India, but as people started to get out of Europe and explore more, and especially after Marco Polo did his expedition, then they realized it was all bull. And there was no, I mean, they weren't willing to let go of the legend. So instead they just shifted it. So they knew that there were some Christian kingdoms in Africa, even though they hadn't had contact with them in a good long time. So they were like, well, I guess the Prester John is over there. And they figured out that he wasn't in India. There's actually a funny story about a Portuguese explorer who went to India. I don't remember what the guy's name was, but basically he was sent to find a Christian kingdom to ally with, that Portugal could be allied with. And when he got to India with his guys, he was like, I guess his brain was like so full of the Prester John legend that he went into a Hindu temple where they were like worshiping in I guess Sanskrit, and he assumed that they were holding like a Catholic mass in some other language, and he took like all of the carvings of Hindu gods and stuff to be like their version of the saints, like their depiction of the saints. So it's hard for me to think he was really that stupid, but it might have been that he just wrote it up that way because the king demanded like you better not come back until you find something for me, in which case he would have had like a ulterior motive to kind of delude himself, or he could have really been that stupid, I don't know. But yeah, that's so they shifted the location of it, and actually I found the depiction of the Ethiopian version of Prester John. It also has very European trappings, like they're wearing European style clothes, and this guy's sitting on like a Gothic throne. And they did kind of try to make them look like Black Africans, but they still didn't look quite right. You could clearly tell that whoever was doing the illustration had not seen an actual African person before. They were just going off of somebody's description, probably a very old description from like Herodotus or something. So
I think like I had seen something, I don't know where, they had said something about like them showing that they were like them having the European style clothing with there's images all around the internet about with that and showing them wearing European style clothing in Africa and in Ethiopia around that time.
yeah, they didn't really know. They had no idea what people from that part of the world were actually wearing. It's kind of like, 20th century sci-fi, like think of like Flash Gordon and Star Trek the original series, where they go to other planets and a lot of the aliens just look like humans because they don't actually know like who would actually be there, assuming anyone would be there at all. So it's kind of guessing. Yeah, like early Middle Ages depictions, like right after coming out of the Dark Age, like depictions of people in other parts of the world, they really had no clue how anybody looked. So there's like a picture that I'll also drop in the slideshow where somebody tried to depict the whole world. And he had like the 3 known continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa. And of course, it's oriented with the East at the top. And he put like Gothic style buildings on all 3 continents. And then he had like 3 white guys wearing European style clothes to represent each continent. So I'm like, it's obvious that he really didn't know who was there and how they looked.
Because it was similar to something like that I saw about Genghis Khan. They said that the same thing about Genghis Khan, that they described him as being like more European or some sort. I'm not sure.
Yeah, they probably didn't. Yeah, because they never saw an Asian person either. I mean, unless you were living in like Eastern Europe or Southern Europe, you might have contact with Muslims who I guess still look kind of similar in terms of their a little bit, more similar in terms of their facial appearance, but I mean, you could still tell that they're not native, they're not from Europe. They're still a bit different. But most people didn't even see the Muslims. They heard about them, like, oh man, the Muslims are doing this over in Spain, or oh man, the Muslims are pushing the Greeks, and hearing about the different things that were happening, but not really knowing. That might also be why they killed so many people on the Crusades, because they just assumed that everybody in the Middle East was a Muslim, out of ignorance. Like, oh, they must be Saracens because they look like Saracens. But at any rate, yeah, that's just speculation. But I think that's probably the case, is they just assumed everybody was a Saracen at first because they didn't know anything about the Middle East. They didn't really know anything. I mean, it's hard. Like, if you were alive in, say, the 900s, and you're like living in Italy or even Germany, like, I want to go and explore Africa, south of the Nile. Well, that's going to be a one-way trip. You're not going to make it back. Like, you might make it there, but then you're going to get caught by Muslims. And we had like another video that we did, like Stilgar did, where he talked about the Barbary pirates, how they used to take people and put them in like the galleys at the bottom of the ship. So like you would not, and that's if you're a man. If you're a woman, you probably have an even worse fate. You'll probably end up being somebody's concubine or something and never getting free again. So yeah, I mean, it's you couldn't really, in that kind of situation, you couldn't really gather information about other parts of the world. I mean, in order to gather the information, you have to go there and then you have to come back. Coming back is the hard part. But of course, as eventually they did go and they found out, and then this legend kind of died off slowly.
And when did the legend start?
Let me see here. Started in the 1100s. Let's see. The letter came out in 1165. The letter that I read you guys 3 paragraphs from. Mario Hunnen visited Rome in 1122. Yeah. Yeah, and the relationship, again, it's like the relationship between Mario Hunnen and Prester John is the relationship between Saint Nicholas and Santa Claus. Santa Claus, basically. Alrighty. Well, I guess if nobody has anything else, I think that's good. I'll go ahead and close it off then.
I mean, I guess the letter inspired a lot of people to explore, right? So even though the story was made up, kind of like science fiction is made up nowadays around different planets and stuff like that, science fiction is also inspiring people about, trying to travel to other planets and things like that. And people were joining the Crusades, or like the Portuguese trying to travel to India and later Ethiopia, and it had a real influence on history, which is kind of cool. How a story like that, like a fantasy story, triggered the imagination of so many people. It actually influenced history. So.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Right. Yeah, that was the fuel for a lot of the European age of exploration, and that's why I was surprised there were so few illustrations of Prester John.
Can you speculate like what led them to say that he took care of all like the creatures? He was over all the creatures.
It's kind of like, so it's kind of like an idealized world, like in Star Trek, which we all 3 of us like. In Star Trek, nobody is, the humans have all made peace with each other. Nobody's persecuting anybody. Nobody's poor. They have a huge, powerful space fleet and an army. There's multiple alien species in it. You got Vulcans and Betazoids, and I guess not really Klingons, but and there's no poverty, there's no vice. People aren't motivated by greed. They got replicators, so everybody has as much of whatever they want. They can eat whatever they want. They got synthahol, so they can get drunk without damaging their liver. It's like same kind of thing, right? Because when they made up all this Prester John stuff, they still believed in the Ptolemaic cosmology, so they didn't really think that there were other planets that could be lived upon. but they treated other parts of the world like other planets that were beyond the realm of their knowledge.
I mean, do you think some portion of it was kind of true to a certain extent?
I think that Mario Hanan probably had an estate for his church. Probably wasn't as big as the papal states, but he probably did have some land. And if you look at like images of India, the churches, like the Indian Orthodox churches, look very nice, and they make use of bright colors, and they carve the stonework. Like they really, the Indian architecture, like all kinds of Indian architecture, they really use colors like in a way that we don't really do here in America or like in any Western country, really. And they also shine like colored lights on them at night too. So, I mean, you can look up some of the images, and it kind of does look maybe like something that could inspire some of these legends of glowing stones and all that. But I think it's mostly just somebody creating a pleasant fantasy. And also it was, for medieval Europeans, Islam was the sword of Damocles that was like hanging over their necks. And it scared a lot of people. So they're trying to find something to kind of give them hope, and also maybe motivate them to go out and fight against the Muslims in other territories. Yeah, I don't think Prester John, I think it's mostly just bogus, but I'll give you the link to the letter. You can check it out for yourself.
Yeah, and I just confirmed just now that the previous Prester John movie is actually, it shows up when you go online and search for Prester John as one of the top videos, which is kind of cool.
Yeah,
So,
that's probably why we got as many views as we got. Not a lot of people talking about it. I guess a lot of people today don't even know about it. There is a Marvel, like Marvel has a Prester John. They also took on this legend.
Yeah, because the name seemed familiar, although I don't watch a lot of specific.
Yeah, he's in Marvel Comics. I don't know, like I think in Marvel Comics he's like I don't want to say something wrong, but I think he's like a crusader that stumbled into some alien technology or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know much about the Marvel version of Prester John. I just saw him in, like some cameos in the Silver Age. But yeah, they took that legend to Marvel. They took a lot of legends, like they took Norse legends, they took Greek legends, and they took Prester John, they took Atlantis. Pretty much anything they can get their hands on, they just absorbed, repurposed. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. All right, so I guess with that, I will close it off. And thanks for coming, guys. And if anybody made it all the way to the end this far, then thanks for listening. So, see you guys in